Hello there, aspiring tennos. I know that I'm late to the punch on this one, but I want to do my own ranking of all the Warframes because I feel like I have a little bit of a different outlook. We'll start with the worst and then make our way up to the best. Also, by the way, all of the Warframes in, let's see, B tier is interchangeable with one another, so it's not in a particular order within a given tier. I'll also say that for me, in order for Warframe to get a high rating, it either has to be really good at in-game content or really good for a very specific purpose, but it doesn't have to be good at both. One does not drag down the other. So without further ado, let's get right to it. And first up we have no other than Yeralia. Yeralia belongs thirdly in the Yeralia tier. She is quite literally the worst Warframe in the game right now, not only because of what she represents, but also because she is so fundamentally broken that I don't even know where to begin. Her Seasoners is a ability that baseline is going to cost you 25 energy to use to CC 5 enemies, and it requires line of sight. That might be the worst dedicated CC ability in this entire game. And then there's Marlena. It's a K-Drive. Do we need to say any more? Also, 75% damage reduction, that's nothing at this stage in the game. There's so much power creep that 75% as your only defensive layers, forget it. Now, I will say that her passive is really good, but having a good passive is not enough when everything else in your kit is so horribly broken beyond repair, right? Anyway, so we have Aqua Blades, which is basically her main ability, and it's so terrible. It's a damage ability that doesn't scale. Do we need to say any more? And then we have Ripped Hide, which for all intents and purposes does not scale, alright? This ability, because it works better with more enemies, really shines on the Steel Path, but the problem is that even when this is at its best, it's still terrible. It barely works for level 150 enemies on the Steel Path, and that's baseline. So she's just not good at anything. She's just really terrible, and I would rather just have a lot of health, which is really bad, and that really speaks volumes. That's why she belongs in her own tier. She needs a rework before we can even begin to discuss how to fix her, because there's no scaling you can play around with. Horrible. Now, I said that the position in each tier won't matter, but specifically for Limbo, it will. In terms of power, I could very easily have given him in an S tier. His defensive abilities are unmatched. Being able to literally leave this plane of reality, as well as completely and permanently stun all enemies within the rift, is just so insanely overpowered. I barely even know where to begin, but he's so annoying. I wish the developers would just reality shift him out of the code. I promise that it will not be this opinionated all the way through, but in particular with Limbo, I wish that he would just be removed, because it's just been trolling for the last 7 years. I legitimately have not seen a Limbo player who were not causing more bad than good, except for the Orphix events, of course, but in general gameplay, get him out of here. Then we have Valkyr, also an F tier, by the way. Ripline, useless. Warcry, incredibly powerful, but also subsumable, so that doesn't really mean all that much. Then we have Paralyze, which is just a pretty bad debuff. So all that's really worth to talk about is Hysteria. And yes, Hysteria is extremely powerful. It literally makes you invulnerable, and it gives you a pretty powerful melee weapon. So what's the problem? Well, that's the problem. She has a lot of power, but she doesn't have any effective way of getting that power to where it needs to be. Warframe, at its core, is about killing hordes, and Valkyr does a really terrible job at that, so therefore the F rating. Next up we have Inaros. There's not really that much to say. All of his abilities are useless, and having a lot of health isn't worth much. The old Wukong was literally immortal until the rework, of course, and I would still consider him to be in his own Wukong tier, if not for the rework. His passive, his revive is completely outdated compared to all of the other saving graces in this game. Once the enemy's level scales above a specific level, you just cannot revive because you cannot do enough damage to kill them. And the fact that the only enemies you can revive off is the weakest ones, which are the least likely to kill you, to tell you how this ability is fundamentally broken. Useless. Then we have everyone's favorite Warframe, and probably the one which most people will agree on. He definitely belongs in F tier, and if I were ranking them within their own tier, he would be low F tier. He's just not useful for anything. If this tier list was made before the Steel Path, then I would probably have been willing to rank him up around C tier, just because using him with the Banshee sonar was the best way to get loot fast with a speed Nova as well. But that doesn't really work on the Steel Path, and that's 2x anyways, so you just get more loot using Chroma. Chroma is a fantastic frame, and the fact that you beat him at this aspect as well, even in team play, means that he just gets a fat F. He's out. Frost sits here alone in E tier. He's just a frame which suffers a lot from legacy gameplay. None of his abilities does anything. Avalanche, yeah, it's guaranteed frost damage, but come on, like, who the hell runs cold these days? Snow Globe was the ability for defense objectives, but he doesn't even have that niche anymore. I would be willing to claim that Gara has him beat there. All in all, he's just desperately in need of a rework. Luckily, it has been up for debate recently. Hopefully, next year he won't be E tier, but right now he is. And he's very nearly F tier, let me tell you that much. Then, a bit more controversially, we have our first frame in D tier, and it's Vauban. Now, Vauban was actually given a rework. Now, I'll say this, Tesla Nervos, useless. Might be kind of cute, but they are useless. Proton Strike, useless. Now, Mind Layers has the Flechette Orb, which is a decent damage ability that scales with enemy levels, but decent is not good enough in this matter of extreme power creep, where the level cap can be reached by pretty much any frame, just of the virtue of melee weapons being so overpowered still. And also in the Lataruk. But still, good CC, not the best in the game. It gives a little bit of armor, but that's kind of meaningless on Vauban because it's not enough. The Steel Path is where you want defensive layers, and this is not enough. So therefore, good buffs, but they don't really amount to anything. So you have to stay in D tier for now. Then we have Loki, which only recently fell from grace, another D tier. Loki really only has his invisibility, which is great, but the problem is that the missions like Spy, where I would want to use this, he's beat by not Ivara, but by Wukong. That might surprise you, but I'll talk more about that when I get to Wukong. His radial disarm is also pretty good, but just having a pretty good ability is not nearly good enough. I will give him some slack because he has the most convenient invisibility, which is a little bit of a niche, and he's pretty good early on, but other than that, no, he only gets a D tier. I feel like this is my first controversial pick, but Rhino makes it into C tier. He's solidly in C tier, but he's no more than C tier. Rhino charge, useless. Iron Skin is obviously insane, I don't need to tell you why, but just being really tanky in Warframe isn't quite enough. There's a lot of Warframes which are insanely tanky, but which also offers some kind of utility, some kind of CC, or even better, some kind of damage as well. And Rhino doesn't have that. His raw just is not that good. There just are better options. Before the helmet system, he would rank quite highly because he has a lot of the things you would want in one package, but since you can create that in a number of different frames, then there's no reason to keep this. Rhino's Stump is just a decent CC, pretty good, but just not good enough. You know, Caliban with his Stump, it's so many times better than this. So unfortunately, Rhino falls into the C tier, and I can really only afford him this tier because he's the best carry, in my opinion, in the index. Outside of that, I just don't think that he's that great. Then we have Nyx, again C tier. The only reason why I see Nyx gets a pass into the C tier is because of Psychic Bolt, which can strip armor defenses and therefore remove armor, which is always going to be pretty powerful. Mind Control, completely useless. Chaos, decent CC, but ultimately I just want to kill stuff, right? Absorb, I actually looked at this and I thought, hey, you know what? This gives me some bonus damage to my weapons. That might be really good. But if you think about this, right, the hammer converts damage by, like, I think it's a 0.3 or 0.45, 6 depending on how much parts you have. So it deals the damage back with 6 times as much efficiency. This, you know, with 600% essentially, and this returns the damage by 0.02%. And it's basically, for all intents and purposes, the same. I know it's scaling on your weapons, so it, you know, but when the disparity is that great, really? Nope. It is not good. It is not good at all. And, you know, I don't even know what to say. I don't understand why it's this low, why it's this terrible. You know, using Absorb is basically the same as going into the operator state and just using your avoid mode. It doesn't do anything. It's literally just sitting still and doing nothing. I really want to just throw Nyx into the F tier, but Psychic Bolts just barely pulls out of it. Yeah, she needs a rework, a real rework, one which fundamentally changes her. I don't even think that she should have the same gimmick because it doesn't work. It's been tried so many times. Just please, a fundamental rework. Thank you. So, Nezha, still in B tier. Firewalker, pretty useless. In terms of being a movement ability, it's pretty damn bad. Her ultimate is just a worse Rhino stump, basically. You know, it's not the worst CC, but it's certainly not the best either. Blazing Chakram, not good either. I mean, it's a fun meme ability, but if you want to take it into a serious mission, it's not gonna work. Her only good ability is Warding Halo. And, you know, I talked about this before, but just having a defensive player is not good enough nowadays. So I very nearly just threw her into F tier. However, it's also a stun, and it stuns enemies whenever they get close to you. So obviously this ability is really good against Infested. So for being really good specifically at survival with infested enemies, I'm willing to pull her up into C tier, but only barely. Grendel. A quick disclaimer here, I have not played Grendel much, so I don't actually know if he's particularly great, but anyways, just looking at his abilities and what I've played him a little bit, obviously, this is terrible, completely useless in late game content, and it's a damage ability, so that's where I would want it. I have this one, which, I mean, obviously it's a meme ability, which is fine, it's meant to be fun, but after playing around with it for 1 or 2 levels, it wasn't fun to me anymore. We have Feast, obviously this is his bread and butter, eat them and then consume them to get the buffs, but the buffs does not look that amazing. C tier. Maybe Ember does not belong in C tier, you could argue that maybe she belongs in B tier. I can't lie, my view of her has been soured by the fact of what she once was. I miss what she once was. A simple frame who good at one specific thing, and that was killing low tier trash, and she was the best at that. Now she's the best at nothing. It's like she has pretty good damage reduction, she has pretty good trash clear, she has pretty decent armor removal, she has pretty decent everything except for her first ability, which is bad. Being pretty good at stuff is not good enough. In this meta, where everything is so insanely power crept as it is, especially with the last couple of updates, she's just not good enough. And I never see her anymore. I feel like she's lost her identity, and her being able to kill trash enemies, I don't see the problem. I don't see the problem. She was thrust into a meta where she now had to try and compete for the late game, and she was never geared towards that. She's just too squishy and she doesn't deliver enough. Very unfortunate they have to put her here in C tier. I really want to hurl Atlas into the do not play category, but in all fairness, I can't do it because he have a couple of things going for him after the rework. I just do not like the Jordan quest. I actually dislike it so much that, again, I would not mind being rid of him. And also, let me just... No, not that. No. You go here. Okay. So we actually see the passive. But anyways, I hate the quest. I don't think he's particularly great. You know, this ability, useless. This ability, useless. This ability, decent. A CC with a little bit of heal and some defensive layers. It's okay. It's just a little bit of armor. Not very impressive, to be honest. And then this is his bread and butter. But in terms of a like meme one button build, there are just better options. So he goes into the C tier. And hopefully he'll stay here forever. Finally making our way into the B tier, it's Xaku. Now Xaku, well, I haven't played him much, and I'm a little bit unsure if he belongs here. He might be A tier. He's very certainly very high B tier. Borderline A tier. I guess I'll just stick with that. Satyr's Whisper is completely underrated, and it's actually very, very, very strong. The Void effect is actually completely busted when you use it with a couple of weapons just because of, you know, it's a bug frame. I have Rest and Raids on him. That's obviously not his second ability. What happened? Okay, so we're back here with Grasp of Loki. And yes, it's a very good ability. It's basically Loki's Disarm, but with less range. But it also gives you the weapons of the enemies. And this actually does some decent damage. But obviously most of his potential comes from Gaze. Being able to remove 100% of the enemy's defensive is really strong. The problem is it doesn't have enough range. Incredibly enough, the 12 meters, it's not enough because you have to put it on an enemy so that you can't fully control where it goes. But the problem is that if you give it more range, then it just becomes the best ability in the game. So also, my main issue with this Warframe is the fact that his ultimate gives him dodge chance. Dodge chance is not good. Being able to avoid 75% of attacks doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that you dodge 3 attacks if the 4th attack still kills you. I would rather have the ability to take some damage every time I get hit and then sustain myself between that. Dodge chance is no good. I know that you can completely break this frame with the helmet system, but the fact that it's buried below these many layers of complexity is actually a huge negative for me, and that's part of why he belongs in B tier. Then we have Sevagoth, still in the B tier. Forma. So many Forma. And you know what? I did it. I put in the Forma, and he still isn't great. He isn't bad either by any stretch of the imagination, and he's very fun. I mean, he has a very unique playstyle. If you like that kind of playstyle, you're gonna like Sevagoth as well, because he certainly is not bad. He pretty much can revive himself endlessly with his shadow, but again, just being immortal doesn't really add much. It doesn't mean anything. If you have a frame that already does something that's incredible and then they're kind of unkillable at the same time, that's what pushes them into S tier. However, Sevagoth doesn't offer anything amazing, so I have to put him here. Protea is a very well-rounded frame. She doesn't really have any incredible problems anymore since her quality of life fixes. Her ultimate ability is pretty bad, but there are many frames with bad ultimate abilities which are still great otherwise. Her first ability is a very great survivability tool, and her dispensary is a fun gimmick that's actually pretty good, and you can use her to level your arc guns. And her second ability is just a pretty good damage ability. It doesn't have amazing scaling, but it doesn't really have to. She's not viable for super late in-game, and she's not really super great at anything specific, but the fact that she's so well-rounded, I think she deserves to be here, especially because you can get her so early on in the game and then just use her as your multi-purpose frame until you get some of these specialists. So I think I can afford her space in the B tier. Lavos, on the other hand, is not a very well-rounded frame. Now, I put him here because, to be honest, I didn't know where else to put him. He's not incredibly powerful or really good at anything, but he has such a unique playstyle, and if you like that playstyle, you're really gonna like him. But if you don't like that playstyle, you won't be able to stomach him, alright? The problem Lavos has is that he has a unique mechanic where instead of resources in terms of energy, he uses his abilities but on a cooldown. And the thing is, Catalyze is the only ability that's worth casting. The rest of his abilities just sets off a Catalyze. It's a cool idea, but obviously you shouldn't put it on a full frame. I mean, could you imagine if Peacemaker on Mesa went on cooldown whenever you used it? That's the main flaw. If this was on someone like Octavia, for example, I think that would be way more interesting. Sorry, man, it's a B tier. Harrow is a frame with a lot of problems. He's a frame who's just given a prime, but they did a couple of fixes for him. However, it didn't really solve his main issues, so we're still suffering from that. But anyways, the main problem he has is that basically Harrow needs to do everything himself in order to be able to support his team. That doesn't really work well for a support frame, so you pretty much just have to play him solo. And you know what? That doesn't really work either, because he does a lot of things well. First ability, a CC that's also survivability, great. Second ability, a really good weapons buff, great. Fourth ability, invulnerability and another weapon buff, great. And the ability to restore energy so that you can pretty much drop Arcane Energize for something else, great. Does it really amount to anything spectacular when you add it all together? No, it doesn't. I wish that it did. I want Harrow to be good because he's such a different experience, but it just doesn't add up too much, unfortunately. I really wish I could place him higher, but even with these quality of life changes, which does help, it still is just a B. Now we have Garuda, which was a frame that was released horribly weak and then buffed, and for a while she was really strong, but then power creep happened and she didn't really get anything, and she doesn't have any innate scaling, and now she's back to being mediocre, which is fine. You can just be mediocre. I think with Breed Surge is quite a bit better, but even then, well, the second ability is made for trolling, and I stand by that. It's a really bad ability that just causes more trouble than it's worth. The fourth ability, pretty bad most of the time, so it's just her first ability, and that doesn't carry her far enough, so we have to keep her here in B tier. Excaliber Umbra. He has a pretty useless meme ability for mobility on his first. That's not good. His Radial Javelin, his third ability, bad CC. His second ability is extraordinarily powerful. It's actually kind of insane. It's both a CC and it opens up enemies to finishers, and it's a blind. So that's really good. Don't underestimate that. The problem is that his Exalted Blade, which he's supposed to be sort of centered around, not that great. It's not that strong. I want it to be, but it isn't. It's pretty powerful, but there's just so many better options. Again, nothing has really happened to make Excaliber Umbra worse. It's just that power creep has kind of surpassed him, and he doesn't really scale as he's more dependent on his own Exalted weapon, which hasn't got any stronger. So we'll have to degrade him all the way down here to B tier. Alright, so then we have Banshee, who is the last Warframe in B tier. I was seriously contemplating putting Banshee in S tier. Why the hell would I even consider that? Well, because Banshee has her sonar, and sonar is actually extraordinarily, insanely broken. You get a really powerful multiplicative weapon buff whenever you hit one of these spots, these weak spots, and with the augments, those spots keep being applied to other enemies when an enemy that's already marked dies. You can cast a lot of these, and if they overlap, then they stack multiplicative with one another. There is no damage buff in this game that comes even close to this. However, other than silence being mildly useful for very specific leveling strategy, none of her abilities do anything. They literally do nothing. And the problem is that she's so squishy. She can't really make use of her sonar effectively herself, so you have to use her in very specialized comps where Banshee doesn't have to fight, where she can just hide away and use her sonar to buff up her team. It's extremely powerful when you can do that, but the setup to do it is so incredible that I don't think that it's really worth it. So therefore I'll just have to leave her down here. Alright, we're now into the A tier, and remember, these are not in order. These are just all in A tier. First up we have Ash, and he certainly pushes. He's almost S tier. He could have been, but yeah, and this is also based on my personal prejudice. Let's talk about him first. He has his Shuriken, and you can use the Shrieking Shuriken augment to strip away all armor. Very powerful, and especially good in Steel Path Disruption. And that's where he really shines. Steel Path Disruption and Survival. In Disruption, he might actually be the best Warframe, but again, might be. Smokescreen, it's just a worse invisibility, but you know, us don't really need as much because he's very powerful outside of just being invisible. Teleport, that's pretty bad. But then we have Blade Storm. Blade Storm is also very good. I mean, true damage, that's very rare to find in the game in general, outside of Slash, of course. And everything just comes together very nicely. There's a lot of very powerful builds for Ash, but again, it's pretty much limited to like in-game endless missions. He doesn't really fill a niche, and I couldn't comfortably say that he was their best at those Steel Path missions. Yeah, I have to put him in A tier, but it's very close to S tier. Vault is not a very good frame, and he's only here in A tier because he fills a role in island hunting which no other frame possibly could, but it's more or less because one of his abilities are being abused in a way that it was never intended to, as a bit of a gimmick. And also he plays second man very well to Saren in Sanctuary Elite Onslaught. Outside of that, Vault is pretty useless just because of the fact that the electric procs doesn't work the way that they should. He's basically been shadow nerfed by DE, and because of this, I don't even want to put him in A tier. I want to put him down in like D tier, but I can't deny that he is the frame for these two purposes, and therefore I have to give him an A. Begrudgingly, I will do it. Trinity almost fell from grace. She's always been a high tier frame, but the kind of support she offers with her energy, we don't really need that in the game anymore, and the duration on her blessing was just a little bit too short. However, she was saved by her new augment, Champion's Blessing. The thing about Champion's Blessing is that it turns Trinity into a DPS monster. Basically, by keeping her allies alive, providing healing for them, and giving them 75% additional damage reduction on top of their other defensive layers. And that's very powerful. If it's just for yourself, that's not good, but when comboed in a way that allows you to give it to everyone, that's insane actually. And the fact that she can deal damage as well is pretty good. Also, Energy Vampire isn't bad, it's not enough to carry her, but when she's already that strong and she offers the team energy, she has to be A tier. She's unfortunately beaten by enough support frames in S tier that I'll have to leave her here in A tier. She was my favorite frame for a long time and I want her to be the best, but I must also acknowledge that she's not. Revenant. This frame is literally immortal as long as you have energy, and he can deal 100% of the enemy's health as damage with a specific combo. And he's incredibly boring. He's A tier. Moving on. So Nidus is actually incredibly powerful, and he's not to be underestimated. He's pretty much immortal as well, even though he needs some resources, but let's be real, that's not very difficult to get. He has a really good CC with his lava. Unfortunately, he doesn't really have any real damage capabilities outside of that. I mean, of course, if you want to sit there and abuse the overpowered heavy attack bleed combo to death, you can do that, and he will be perfectly servable. He's very boring in that sense, unfortunately. I put Eclipse on, but you can keep the link if you want a little bit more defensive abilities. Not much more to say. He's A tier. You might be surprised to see Nekros up this high. I know that a lot of people rate him poorly because they think that he's just a basic loot frame with his Desecrate. Nekros doesn't have to be this. He's Augmented Soul of Shadows, I think that's what it's called. It basically allows his clones to take damage for him instead. It's a 96% damage reduction, which is pretty much everything you could ask for in an augment, and the enemies are not gonna kill your shadows very easily just because health scales faster than damage, and your shadows are literally resurrections of the enemies you've killed, so the level of the enemies will always determine how much health they have. So that makes them insanely tanky. Terrify isn't a bad ability either. It's not a great one, but it's not a horrible one. You can use his Despoil to activate Arcane Avenger very easily, which means you can use a different aura mod, and that really matters. There's a lot of power in the aura mod. But that's about it. You can also use health conversion for some more armor, but that's pretty much all there is to him. He's pretty basic. He's just a pretty good like melee weapon frame with a good bit of damage reduction. He's so tanky, and he of course also will give you more loot, which is worth quite a bit. So yeah, that pretty much pushes him into A tier for me. I think it's pretty interesting that Mirage is sort of framed as this trickster frame, because I feel like that's everything that he's not. He's probably one of the most blunt frames. He doesn't really have any too solid of a defense, and she doesn't really offer any utility. She's up this high because she just deals so much damage. Her first and third ability is incredibly powerful, and with a blind that is more damage as well. She does so well also with her augment mod in Sanctuary Elite Onslaught. I have been beaten before on Saren by a Mirage who is just incredibly good at playing her, and that's quite the feat. So yeah, she makes the A tier. I don't care what you say, Mag is actually really powerful. The only good, I mean, Pulverize is not useless, but it's certainly not a great ability either. The only really good or useful tool she has is Magnetize, but Magnetize, basically because of the broken interaction it has with both projectiles and hit scan weapons, are completely insane. It's very, very, very powerful as a DPS tool, and you know what? The game doesn't count it as a damage dealing tool, so you can use Eclipse at the same time. And you gotta keep in mind that Pulverize is at the same time a insane defensive option, because all melee enemies which want to get close to you are pulled into the middle of it, and so is the ranged ones, and when they attempt to shoot you they won't be able to do so because their bullets are being attracted towards the middle of the circle that they're already inside of. So you pretty much cannot be killed, and on top of that you're gonna deal a lot of extra damage because of the broken interaction with these bubbles. An easy A tier for me. Then we have Ivara, or Ivara Prime in this case. I don't know, I was pretty ready to just throw her in the trash just because I didn't think she was much more than a simple spy frame. It turns out Ivara is incredibly powerful. It all comes down to one augment that allows her to have no less than 200% additional critical damage. In case you don't know, base damage and critical chance is kind of easy to come by in terms of external sources such as arcanes or buffs. However, critical damage is incredibly hard to come by, so the fact that she has this much of it in a augment mod, that's crazy. Not to mention that she has infinite stealth, invisibility, and yeah, she's just so strong. Using her with the Nataruk is probably the freest way to hit Endless in survival, and I think that's very much so worthy of this A rating. Now that I'm here, I'm not actually so sure that Hildren deserves to be A tier. Her ultimate ability is a very strong CC that also provides the team with energy, but you know, she's not really able to attack. Her first ability is a decent weapon, but that doesn't really allow her to go endless. As a support, she's not that great, is what I would have said, but then I remembered that Pellet also removes all status effect from allies, and with that she's very worthy of her A rank. Now, Pellet is just an insane ability. It basically makes you immortal, and you can use it on other frames as well, which my mind is blown. It's a free shield gate basically, and yeah, it also strips some defensive layers. For this reason, I will afford her a ranking. So Gara, she has dethroned Frost as the defense queen. Well, I mean, I guess he was the king, but now she's the queen. She has a endlessly scaling damage setup, and she has some of the best defensive capabilities both for herself and for her team as well. So why is she only A tier? The only thing really holding her back is the fact that it's a continuous setup. It takes a long amount of time to set up her damage, and if you screw it up once and let her timer run down to 0, then you have to start all over again, and that's straight up painful. That's what holds her back. So Equinox, I would like to give an S rating, but since rest and raids is now replaceable, subsumed onto other Warframes, it's not really something of a speciality which only she can do. So she still gets an A rating because she's really good in Sanctuary Elite Onslaught as a secondary or third player, where she can just blow up the room every couple of 10 to 15 seconds and essentially skip an entire rotation of enemy spawns. And I think that's still worthy of an A rating. So Chroma, I've already done a video on him. I think he's great. I think he belongs in A tier. I think that, just having a lot of armor, and I mean a lot of armor, as well as a pretty decent base damage buff, is good enough. I think that Chroma is really powerful, and I think he very much so deserves this A rating. Why not an S rating? He can't really go infinite, and he works best in, infinite missions, so that's a bit unfortunate. Also, when played against something like Toxin enemies, he just rolls over and dies. So I can really only give him an A rating, even though I kind of want to give him an S rating. He's really fun to play though, I do recommend him. Then we have Caliban, our most recently added Warframe. Caliban's actually really strong, and it's been a while since we've had a Warframe that was actually released in a pretty powerful state. I didn't get to play him pre-buffs, like he got like a hotfix buffs, which, I mean, if they keep buffing them that much on release, then okay, whatever. Caliban, yeah, very, very strong. All of his abilities are pretty mediocre, and some of them are straight up bad. His first ability is pretty bad, but his fourth ability is just insane. It's basically gaze, except you decide where you place it, and like gaze, it's a effect that lingers on the ground. So put this on a choke point, and then you just don't have to deal with any of the enemy's defensive layers. Not armors, not shield, no, nothing. It's really strong, and it pulls him into A tier. He's not a very high A tier, but he's definitely A tier. So Wukong, right? He's pretty good. Is he A or S tier? He's A+. I want to put him in S tier, but I can't. His Celestial Twin is the only good summon minion in this entire game, and I'll stand by that. Equinox's Twin is just too gimmicky because it locks you out of the rest of the kit if you're in the wrong mode for what you want to do. And if you want to switch, then you have to kill the clone, so it's a compromise. And also it's too squishy, it dies too easily. But this one's really good, deals a lot of damage, very tanky. Super great. Cloud Walker, fantastic movement ability, and it opens enemies up to finishers, so it's more than just a movement ability. I'm a huge fan of this. This is such a good ability. The ability itself is like S++. Defy, it's a decent enough ability. It can save you in a pinch, and it gives you some armor. Tankiness is always nice. This is not the best tank ability, but again, he already does a lot of good stuff, and therefore any added sort of ability is great. Thermal Thunder, I just have this here as a placeholder. You can use pretty much anything that you think would be good on him. His fourth ability is pretty pathetically terrible. That doesn't really matter because we're living in an era where having 3 good abilities is pretty much the best you can't do, because now that one bad ability can be replaced with Eclipse or whatever you want to put on there. So yeah, the problem is, in endless missions, he just becomes a very tanky frame. He doesn't really have anything outside of his Celestial Twin. It's just not that great of a damage ability, and therefore he does really bad at the end game. And on top of that, he's a great jack of all trades. Really, he's really good at a lot of different missions. I think he might be the best at Spy, but you don't do enough Spy that I can justify him being an S tier. So he's just so tantalizingly close to being S tier, but I have to put him as an A+. Here we are in S tier. These frames are here for different reasons. Oberon is here because he just have a completely solid support kit. This is the best of the best. It all comes down to renewal with the Phoenix Augment. when you die or when a teammate dies, they just don't die. They return to life instead. This does have cooldown, but that's not that big of a deal. In Warframe, you don't die from sustained damage. It is one unfortunate blow which kills you. Being able to just say no and then being alive is really good. Being able to do that for your entire team is insane. Hallowed Ground is some decent CC. It's not great, but you know, anything at this point is completely awesome. We have Reckoning, which is a armor strip on top of all of that, and that just pushes him over the edge, making him a clear S ranking for me. I cannot believe that I'm saying this, but Zephyr is actually really meta, and she's well deserving of a S ranking. I've been shitting on Zephyr for years, and then she gets this small rework and all of a sudden she's incredible. Turbulence is just shenanigans. Bullets cannot hit you. Think about how insane that is. And also Zephyr has the ability to stay airborne forever, so she's never in risk of taking damage from melee targets. If you play well, you cannot die on Zephyr. You can be up in the air so high that even the clouds, like the toxin clouds from the infested, cannot get you. It's actually insane. Even the grappling hooks of the infested cannot hit you while this is active. So this is well and truly shenanigans. But as I said before, just being immortal doesn't do anything. So what does Zephyr offer that pushes her over the edge? Well, only one of the most insane CC and grouping abilities, her tornadoes. Actually being able to scoop up all of the enemies, and then when dealing damage to a tornado, you will deal damage to all enemies in the tornado. And that is what makes Zephyr so incredibly, insanely powerful. Well deserving of a S ranking. Cannot believe that I'm saying that, but I am. It's a Warframe I initially slept on. When Wisp was released, I didn't think much of her. I mean, yeah, sure, she was a pretty decent support frame with her first ability. I didn't realize how insane her first ability actually is as a support frame. But then on top of that, she has her Breed Surge, right? Breed Surge is just very powerful, and I'm not gonna try and explain why. It is slightly complicated. Her Soul Gate isn't great, but you can replace that. Now, the thing that actually makes Wisp so good, and which makes her so deserving of her #1 spot, is the fact that the day that she was released, her basically when she's in the air, she's not invisible, she's undetectable, okay? And this means that she was able to get the full stealth damage bonus, and because of that, people were literally hitting the damage cap on day 1 of her being released. This has since been fixed, but she can deal out the incredible damage. Go ahead and make a heavy attack glaive build, and for the glaive frame, using it on her, and then come back and tell me how it went. Here's another frame, which I cannot believe is meta, but she is, and she's incredibly meta. Titania is not a good frame. She has a lot of problems that really drags her down. Her ability to do Endless is pretty close to 0, but she's an S tier. How can she be S tier? She's S tier because she's the best at cracking relics. And cracking relics is a huge part of this game, and it will always be a huge part of this game. Using her with Thermal Sunder actually makes her kind of insane for that. With her Razor Blitz, I think it's called, her augment, which gives her crazy speed whenever she uses abilities. She just speed runs the level while casting an ability which is a huge AoE, killing all the enemies. If you're running the kind of relics that you should be, which is Exterminate or Capture, this is so good. She's actually insane at this, and therefore I can only conclude that she deserves her rating. She's S tier. Can you believe that? I've made a video in which I declare Saren Prime to be the best Warframe in the game, and I stand by that. I really think she is the best. She's outdone by other Warframes when it comes to certain activities, but Warframe is primarily about killing hordes of enemies, and no one does that better than Saren Prime. My Eczema is a ability that deals a lot of damage, has a ginormous range, goes through walls, and applies the best status effect in the game. That in of itself is deserving of a S ranking, and I really mean that. On top of that, her spores is some of the best scaling damage in the game, and it applies corrosive, which is also one of the best status effects in the game. Those two are baked into her kit, and it just comes on top of this very powerful damage dealing combo in of itself. Her third ability is only good for melee builds, but she can be really good with that. She doesn't really have a lot of survivability, but luckily her mold is pretty bad. Replace that with something like Manticore or maybe Ensnare, depending upon how much, like how active you want to be. If you want to be in a choke point or if you want to be out in the open. And with that, you just go ahead and you kill the enemies as quickly as you can, and she's really good at it. She's not the best on the steel path, but the fact that she can hold her own there reasonably well, especially with the Glaive Prime, I'm just saying. She can shield gate as well. That's another thing just going for her. You know, I'm not rating the best Warframe today, but if I were to, I would still put Sarah in here. She's just so good at across so many different applications that I don't know who else I'll put in that spot. Also, I forgot to mention that she has some of the best and most engaging gameplay in this entire game, so it's okay for her to be broken. It doesn't behoove me to play Octavia. I think she's quite boring, and well, she's well deserving of her ranking as a S tier frame, as she can pretty much single-handedly go endless with close to zero investment, and there's just no other frames which can do that. She's probably the most free frame in terms of that. She's really boring. I really think she is. The fact, ignore the fire blast, that's me experimenting, it did not go well, but let me tell you, the mantle cord, that's a really powerful ability, and the fact that you probably wouldn't even have noticed until it was subsumable, just because, well, other abilities are so insane. You get so much out of nothing with a third ability, no effort, but so much benefit both to you and to your team. Fire rate, invisibility, all of that, multi-shot to your entire team. Holy hell. Not to mention the fact that her hammer can just kill everything. Her fourth ability is probably her worst ability, but that doesn't matter. Just subsume it with something else. She's insane. Boring, but insanely powerful. So Nova. Nova is at this spot for two reasons. First up, she is the cornerstone, I want to say, of the basic farming squad. She offers something which no other frame can, and that's speeding up the enemies. Faster enemies, walk into your kill zone faster, more enemies die, more loot. From my experience, the fewest amount of people in terms of having the different setups, in terms of having Nekros or Chroma or whatever, the fewest amount of people seem to have Speed Nova. So just having Speed Nova basically grants you access to any farming squad you want to be part of, and this really hurries up your progression throughout the game, and I think that alone is worth an S rating. Now with her molecular fission, I think it's called, her augment, she just straight up can become immortal with the right build. I mean, she can get 100% damage reduction, and I mean that. I'm not talking like 99.99999 something. You can actually set it up so that you have 100% damage reduction. There's a lot of videos on how to do that, so I'm not going to explain it here. But yeah, I think that makes her very but so worthy of this position. Mesa Prime. Before we get into why she's great, I have a little bit of complaint I have to make to the community as a whole. There's a lot of people who say that Mesa is boring because you just stand in one spot and then kill the enemies from there. That might be true specifically from the index, but I want you to go ahead into the steel path right now, activate your shatter shield, and then just stand there and see how long you survive. Mesa does not survive long without some kind of support or by moving. If you bullet jump and then while in the air, you can actually cast your fourth ability and do a lot of damage before you hit the ground, and then repeat that over and over again. I actually like Mesa because yes, she's ST and she's extremely powerful because of her Peacemaker, which is why she's in S tier, by the way, just because of the Peacemaker and the damage and the precision that it offers. Also, she's really good at the index, she's the best. DPS there, I don't care, Wukong, go home. She's not invulnerable. She doesn't have some kind of incredible bullshit mechanic that just gets her out of any chance of dying, and the stress of actually having to play well, I feel like that really elevates her gameplay, and that's why she's in S tier. And she's really difficult to play. She's not a no-brainer at like in-game content. Not at all. So, I mean, I don't know why people are saying that. I think you need to play her some more in that kind of content. Okay, anyways, so I'm using pellets on her here, and I know it's a some souped ability, but the fact that it works so well on her because it reflects ranged damage with 95% efficiency, being able to have a lot of shield on Nezha is really good. This really elevates her. Having access to pellets, the combination of pillars and shadow shield is a very powerful defense when moving around, and her Peacemaker deals out a lot of damage. So good damage, high precision, a very unique and fun way of playing. I mean, come on. She deserves to be in S tier. Chroma is the frame for farming on the steel path for basic resources if you're going solo, alright? Even if you're going with a team, I would still recommend that you use her. You use the Strangle Dome, and then you use Whip Claw for damage. And if you use a good stat stick, even better if you have a ribbon for it, but you don't need it. I got mine for 400 and I can just kill everything for 3 hours. So nigh perfect defense with Strangle Dome, Whip kills everything, and then with the augment you get 65% more loot. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. In terms of farming, it is Chroma, she's the one. Baruch. I've already done a video on why he's so great, and considering that this video got 1,000 views, I would have to wager that you guys agree with me for the most part. You can be running around with literally 99.999% damage reduction while dealing red crits and just absolutely one-shotting everything on the steel path. Also, he becomes a lot more powerful when you have pellets available to you because it's not armor. It's damage reduction, at least most of it is. So having that on your shield is really good. Now the thing about Baruch is that unlike most of these other top tier frames, he does not benefit from camping. He actually benefits mostly from running around. You can't really say that about most frames, and because of this he offers some of that high octane gameplay that Warframe is. I mean, that's when Warframe is played at its best in my opinion. And the fact you can do that while being competitive and playing in-game content, please never nerf this frame. If there's a frame that doesn't deserve to get nerfed, it's this one. Yeah, easy S tier for me. And finally, our last entry on this list is Gauss, or Gauss, depending upon how you want to pronounce that. I like Gauss because, well, all of his abilities kind of make sense. I have Infest Mobility on here just for fun and giggles. Obviously, don't replace his second ability. His kit works because all of his abilities feel like they have a use case, and that's kind of rare. I like the idea behind it as him, you know, him being a speedy frame, and I agree. For in-game content, he's the best. He's just the best. He pretty much offers you everything that you would want. He can be a little bit tedious to play sometimes, but he just offers so much. Weapon buffs is where it's at, and he has a pretty damn good survivability with his second ability. The fact that he started recharging his shield sooner gives him an easier shield gauge, which is huge actually. That's worth a lot. Some built-in damage reduction, some CC with his first ability. He's just good all around. And I genuinely do believe that he deserves not only his slot as the S rank, but also in terms of endless content, he's just the most powerful, not the most fun, not the best overall frame, but he has the highest potential for endgame. And with that, I'll see you in the next one.